Hello.
Roshan. Hello.
Good evening, Mr. Negi. We can hear you.
I said you're without any warm clothing.
No, I have inner layer, as in like a layer, not a food and drink layer, but a layer. It's almost like a greenhouse here. It's quite warm inside this hall. But it's good to have you online. We didn't want to see you on a recorded message. So it's great to see you. Welcome, Mr. Khurana also. Thank you for joining in. We are waiting for Bafrang to join in.
Thank you, Mr. Roy. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. Welcome, Bafrang. Welcome to Darjeeling.
Hello, check. Yeah. So good evening, welcome for those who are here with us and for those who have connected on below. I welcome you all again. From biodiversity, now we move into a very interesting session, and that is sustainable food systems. And we have this session broadly into two segments. One, where we are going to talk about food systems as in its definition and how it existed before and in the traditional sense. And later on, we shall move to the present, the contemporary consumption patterns after this. I'm Benita Shah, and I'm presently the treasurer of IMI. I'm also the CEO of SARG India, a civil society organization working largely with organic agriculture across 4 states of India. And I would like to introduce the esteemed group of people here to my left and right. Mr. Roshan Rai on my left, also a member of IMI and also heading DHI. To my right, Mr. R.P. Gurung, also member DHI and also member IMI. And to my extreme right, Mr. Abhishek Pradhan, who's a volunteer here. He's also a part of DHI and the World Wildlife. Oh, sorry, he's not from WII. He's a volunteer with IMI. My job here is to build the context of food systems. So I'd like to take you through. Food systems in its true incarnation existed when humanity was an agrarian-based civilization. Food systems took its order from nature, and nature's rhythms decided the type of food crops and other plantation which could grow. These in turn gave rise to other smaller systems like animal husbandry, other agri-based activities. The biodiversity that is in its flora and fauna, the forest landscapes, and also to a great extent, even the clothing and the trade had intricate interdependence. Thus, food systems signified the sum total of the entire land-based culture of humanity, until, of course, modern agriculture production, as we all know, the intensive agriculture production started. Today, food systems really don't exist. And it's a question, how can they be relevant today? Food production, as we all know, has moved from family farms to commercial production, feeding into industry, or farms have become industrial production houses. We know the Western world is full of it. Less than 3% people farming in the US, less than 4% people farming in Europe. And in India, we are more or less heading towards that model. In a short spell of time, however, these models are already throwing up tremendous challenges to environment in the form of degradation and toxicity of soil and water, the residues, pesticides or other additive residues in our food, in animal husbandry, especially the industrial animal production due to the increase of meat eating habits in particularly our country, the transmission of zoonotic diseases, and all of its impact on human health. Challenges, however, do throw up solutions, and policies are being reviewed, renewed at most times. We're happy to say that now the concept of systems is finally coming back scientifically, as we would like to say. And now we're talking about forest development as forest landscapes. We're talking about food production as farming systems. The SDGs have very pointedly said and talked about the importance of interdependence of different small systems related to production, value chain, consumption, and disposal. It says in its official definition of food systems. In India, however, we have small initiatives to celebrate and welcome. India announced the first time ever the MSP on millets, minimum support price on millets, yes. It is a great boost, welcome decision for rain-fed farming systems, especially for the IHR, states like Uttarakhand, not only IHR, even for states like Andhra Pradesh, like Karnataka, like Orissa, all these states who have huge, large tracts of rain-fed farming agriculture, which were initially farming systems actually producing crops, the lesser known crops as we know. About 7 years ago, an ICAR center has been set up in Modipuram, which is focusing on the integrated farming systems. Yes, integrated farming systems, which look at remodeling how monocultures can be converted, if at all, by small family farms, where there is horticulture and there's apiculture together, or if there is a cereal, there can be a pulse or even a pisciculture. If there is agroforestry, whether there can be apiculture along with it, or if there is sheep farming, can there be meadow farming along with it? So these are the new integrated systems which will be coming along, though it is still on a research mode. Organic agriculture policy, of course, which was spearheaded by mountain states almost 15 years ago. Today, the government of India has an organic farming policy. There is a huge flagship project, PKVY, the Paramparik Krishi Vikas Yojana, which talks about organic agriculture. It's not just the IHR, but close to 8 states of India who have now organic policy in place. And we have a few 100,000 farmers now practicing certified organic agriculture. Organic agriculture, by definition, promotes indigenous seeds, fiber, and a systems approach. What is, however, the challenge is whether we will be and we are able to develop and design models on these farming systems, which can actually support the livelihood options of the farmer family, as well as support the local economy. Can these be integrated and put together as the farming, as the food systems production, as we would really like it to be? And here I'd like to point that food systems are, in fact, about not just food, it's medicine, it's fiber, it's holistic in itself. It has interdependence with livestock. And we all know that most of our traditional food systems, which had crops like the millets, were like the nutraceuticals, like the condiments, like the different herbs which grow around, were basically powerhouses of nutrition. They are C4 crops, which are climate smart, they are climate resilient. Most of the millets, most of our ancient crops or lesser known cereals like the buckwheat, like the amaranth, they have a higher straw index. When you have a higher straw index, you have more fodder for livestock. Fodder is a huge problem in the entire IHR, which is actually has great effects on the depletion and on the lowering down of livestock. So the list of integration is very long and complex, and that is why it has nurtured us for so long. I just want to enumerate a small example. Many years ago, I was going to a village in Gangolihat in Pithoragarh, a village called as Jajut. I was accompanied by a very old man, close to 90. And when we passed through a very beautiful lush oak forest, I just exclaimed, "Oh, this is a beautiful, as they say, grade 3 forest." I just wanted to use the forester's language. He said, "It may be a very good forest." But then he said in Hindi, "This is a Baj Banik." I said, "What is a Baj Banik?" This is the first time I've ever heard of this. He says, "Baj Banik is not just an oak forest having broad leaf, other crops, other trees along with it, like rhododendron or utis, etc. It is a house, a place which has numerous species of not just forest trees, but medicinal trees going along with it." And he actually showed me that this forest had all the 3 ingredients of trifla in it. For example, it had avla, harad, baheda growing wildly in that oak forest, which was the Baj Banik. And then he also showed me in the lower areas, in the shrub areas, the wild growth of Brahmi, which was also growing, which was a part of this oak Baj Banik. I really understand. I feel I don't know how many foresters know about the existence of Baj Banik. And what he told me was that the entire folk, the entire people of that village would just go out, they would feed, just the children would go in the morning, they feed on the Brahmi. Later on, the other women folk would go and pluck the ingredients of trifla, have it. And this was a beautiful example of the kind of food systems which was not just food as we are looking at as grains and pulses, but the entire gamut of our nutrition, which included medicine, which included condiments, which included spices, and even fiber. So this was actually, I think, the story or the position or the imagery of a food systems which I had in my mind. Unfortunately, it's no longer there at every place or at many places. And we have to see and remodel how we can really see and actually whatever part of it we can still resurrect and create a new model which is relevant today. With this, my friends, as a context setting, I'd like to invite now our next speakers. But before, I'd like to invite to my extreme right, Mr. Abhishek Pradhan, who has been busy doing a poll. So I'd like to hand over the mic to him. Thank you.
Thank you, Vinita ma'am. So in the Hubilo platform, if you look at the chat box, there's a link to a poll shared. It will take you to Mentimeter, and then you can go ahead with the poll. The first question there is actually, how often do you eat local food? So it's just in your opinion, nothing's right and wrong. Please answer the question. It's a multiple choice question. So Once the screen is shared, you'll be able to see how it's going. Yeah, the first question there was, how often do you eat local food? And we can see like 40% have voted for very often. And yeah, 40% have again voted for seldom. 20% people say that they eat local food all the time, which is really great. And none of us have voted for no, not at all. Okay, with the votes are still rolling in. So once you have voted for the first part, there's the next part of the poll, and it is actually a word cloud. So we can move to the next part, I think so. So for the word cloud, the question is, why do we eat packaged food? So it's a opinion-based question again, and we have 3 slots for entries. So in the 3 slots, we can actually write anything. No, it's like it's our personal reason for choosing packaged food. It can be due to the taste, due to convenience. Like it can be how it's advertised to be better. Again, if you are in the Hubilo platform, the link to this poll is in the chat box. Okay, like entries have come in. We can see convenience has a big part in the center of it. And yeah, actually the convenience lies in the center of why packaged food is occupying large market spaces. Easy access, easy to cook, cheap and tasty, easy and tasty, ignorant, accessible to our company if need buy. I don't know what that means. Easy takeaway, the convenience and taste. Yeah, the packaged food are ready meals. They are way easier to cook and to get access than local food. The craving, yeah. And some people don't like to eat packaged food, which is good both for the health and the environment. It's cheaper than other food. It's easily available. It's easily available. We don't have a choice. Yeah, we feel like that a lot of times, that we don't have a choice but to eat packaged food. Stay hungry, overeat Maggie. So Maggie wins. So I think so with this, we are much clear about this part. So the next part, in the next part of the poll, we have asked the question, what prevents you from buying from the local markets, selling traditional items? Yeah, there are many reasons, like for example, for packaged food, the main reason was easy availability. So maybe the traditional foods aren't available where you are, or maybe you don't like the taste of it. Please put those, put your answers into the word. This is a word cloud again, so you can have a maximum of 3 entries, anything that you feel. So we have answers coming in. What prevents you from buying from the local markets selling traditional items? Availability, yeah. Ready to made. Food safety, okay, that's interesting. Not much available, very rarely available. The price, two people have actually written price. Non-standard, non-easily accessible, far away. The supply, high profit margin, okay. Low benefits to producers, not much easily available, not easily available, not often available. Yeah, so availability is again a big card out here. We can see from the polls. The middlemen deciding prices. Yeah, that happens a lot with these local organic food that the farmers don't sell themselves and the middlemen decide the prices. Non-standardized, inaccessible anytime. Okay, yeah, the accessibility is also a very big aspect. Okay, thank you so much everyone for contributing this poll. With this, I again pass the mic to Binita ma'am. Thank you everyone.
Thank you, Abhishek. We all know that that now today, especially after COVID, there has been a huge conscious movement of nutraceuticals, organic, indigenous foods, millets, etc. And I think it's all, as far as the food systems are good, are concerned, it's for the good for them. Now I'd like to invite our next speaker for the session of Sustainable Food Systems, Ba Frank Roy. Frank Roy is the coordinator of a Rome-based Indigenous Partnership for Agrobiodiversity and Food Sovereignty, TIP. He belongs to the Khasi Indigenous Peoples Community of Northeast India. He started his work way back in 1971 in bureaucracy, but later joined IFAD. He rose to be in IFAD and further in FAO, almost the level of Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations. He's founder of the Northeast Slow Food and Agrobiodiversity Society, and he was also as a team member of the action tracks of the UN Food Systems Summit, which happened, I think, in America in September 2021. He was joining us online, we feel, from Europe. I'd like to welcome Ba Frank Roy.
Thank you very much, Ms. Shah. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. You're very much audible, sir.
All right. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. And I'm grateful for being invited to take part in this 2021 summit of the IMI, the Integrated Mountain Initiative. It brings back many fond memories of my discussions with Dr. Tolia about including Northeast India to be part of the IMI. And Amba Jamil, who I think is with you there, worked very hard to make it happen. Holding the 8th Sustainable Mountain Development Summit in Shillong on the 4th of November 2019 was, I think, an achievement. Like Dr. Tolia, I too was part of the IAS, and I was posted to Maharashtra in July 1970 as I was leaving for Missouri to join the other newly selected All India Services probationers. My father came to me and said, "Son, do not forget the values passed down to us by our forefathers." These words helped me to slowly discover my own indigenous people's food systems. Allow me to relate a bit of my story because I think it has some important lessons for all of us, particularly for those from the Northeast and for a world that is sending distress signals. In 1972, I was posted to Ratnagiri in the Western Ghats of Maharashtra for my first regular charge as a sub-divisional officer. I have good memories of the rural dwellers of Ratnagiri. I particularly enjoyed my chats in the villages with groups gathered by the local revenue officials to meet the new SDO Sahab. Many came to the meetings as the word had gone around that he looks different. I was told later by some of the officials that one of them was asked, "Did China win the war? Why do we have a Chinese SDO?" Ratnagiri was otherwise a sleepy and uneventful town. However, when the commissioner of Bombay Division announced his tour of the district, it stirred the local officialdom. The DC organized a reception at his residence, where I was one of the invited guests. We were introduced one by one to the commissioner. When I was introduced as the new IAS officer of Ratnagiri, the commissioner looked at the rest and nonchalantly said in Hindi, "Ye log kahan se tapak ke aa gaya?" I smiled with embarrassment as I saw the sudden frosty look at the faces of the others. His ignorance of his country's beautiful cultural, biocultural, linguistic, and religious diversity baffled me. But later in life, I realized that many of us have been of the value of diversity and of the fact that there is no agriculture without agrobiodiversity, a fact known to all the indigenous communities in Northeast India and affirmed today by FAO and other international organizations. In 1975, I was posted as the CEO of Bandara district, one of the rice bowl districts of Maharashtra, that was severely hit by drought in 72-73. I was awarded for being the best organizer of this in the state for the 75 Kharif campaign. That same year, I was also given a 1,000 rupees award for being the best family planning organizer in India. It was my year of achievement, thanks to the 7,000 odd staff who were excited to be part of a winning and inclusive team. I was then transferred to another district situated just north of Bombay, Thane. Encouraged by the success of Bandara district, I was hoping for higher achievements as the IAS performance mania was slowly getting ingrained in me. It did not turn out that way. The Adivasis, who constituted about 14% of the population of the district, live in an austere existence that is integrally tied to nature. Their food was simple, but varied and nutritious. They thrive when their self-determination and rights to the ancestral lands were acknowledged. The Green Revolution package that we so successfully promoted in Bandara was simply a no-no for them. They simply told me that their local resources of diverse plants and meat gave them the food security they needed as long as they had a respectful approach to nature. Thane was my turning point as I was reminded of my father's words and of the value of nature. I was reminded that indigenous peoples like Adivasis of Thane have a sacred relationship with nature, and therefore biodiversity is very important for them. I was reminded of a traditional practice in my own Khasi tribal community. When a child is born, the umbilical cord is taken and kept in a small basket container, which was then tied to a tree to signify our bonding with nature. Other communities have similar practices. For example, the indigenous peoples of Eastern Polynesia have a similar practice. They bury the placenta of a newborn at the base of a fruit tree so that the substance that nourish the fetus will nourish the tree. In my community, also like in other indigenous communities of Northeast India, every morning the lady of the house, the first thing she does is to light a fire with twigs and cooks the family meal. She then cleans a simple fireplace and neatly collects all the ash. Then she goes to the shifting cultivation fields to spread the ash on the fallow land and gather food that the fallow areas may have, like sweet potatoes. The women do this as part of the inculcated value that what we take from Mother Nature, we must return. They recognize that when soil health gets better, crops, wild edibles, and animals also get better. Indigenous food systems have a holistic vision of being part of nature. Their governance systems value solidarity and dignity of all. Their oral knowledge is abundant, and they have diets that are rich because of agrobiodiversity. They are resilient because they respect biodiversity and planetary boundaries. During the UN Food System Summit and the recent COP26 meeting, we heard voices within the conference rooms and from the barricades that clearly stated that many of us still have hope in the face of the impending climate disaster, but, and only but, if our current dominant narrative changes and the public in general come to appreciate the real game-changing solutions, such as Indigenous people's food systems, that they do exist and are waiting for promotion by national and international institutions. Studies undertaken by FAO, McGill University, and even by the National Institute of Nutrition in Hyderabad have also shown that the diverse food systems of Indigenous peoples are in fact productive, equitable, and sustainable, and in some cases may have already achieved zero hunger for some Indigenous communities. A few months ago, March 2021, and during the COVID period, TIP and NESFAS, in collaboration with FAO, studied the prevalence of moderate or severe food insecurity in 18 Indigenous peoples' villages of Meghalaya and Nagaland, using FAO's Food Insecurity Experience Scale. The study showed that severe food insecurity is virtually non-existent in these 18 villages, while moderate food insecurity in 2020 was experienced at 11.3%, as against South Asia's level of 43.8% and the global level of 30.38. This is an example of how the local biodiversity resources of Indigenous peoples, of wild plants and trees, have been able to uphold the food security of all. Northeast India represents one of the 12 mega biodiversity spots of the world, and it comprises about 50% of the total biodiversity of India. We conducted a mapping of agrobiodiversity and dietary diversity in 32 villages in Nagaland and Meghalaya. We found that on an average, one village has about 200 food plants, including crop varieties, mushrooms, and condiments. A few villages even reach 300 plants. We also conducted dietary diversity and found that unfortunately, only 36% of the respondents consume a diverse diet. 5 group out of the 10, and the standard used by FAO, indicating that much more work has to be done to link nutrition, health, and the environment with local food practices. Despite these credentials, Indigenous peoples are often considered vulnerable by mainstream narratives. We are not, but we have often been pushed into situations of vulnerability. Our equitable land and food systems are constantly bombarded with values and narratives that lack empathy and care for nature or people. We are being developed by economic systems that are essentially driven by domination and profit. Our equitable food systems are being disturbed by the modern day scramble for extractive industries, hydro projects, and industrial agriculture, particularly in some parts where there are no formal recognition of collective rights, leading to forced migration, loss of biodiversity, and unfortunately, the militarizations of some of our territories. Our current food system is broken. Our biodiversity loss, our climate breakdown, and growing inequality are simply pushing us over the edge. We desperately need to craft a new agrobiodiversity story or narrative that will create an environment where the wonders of contemporary science and indigenous people food systems are equally blended. But to do this, we will need to promote innovations to tap the bewildering biodiversity of our nutrition-rich whole grains, legumes, nuts, fresh vegetables, and fruits. We will need encouragement to convert our backyard and forest gardens into home pharmacies for proteins and micronutrients. We will need to broaden the ecological knowledge of our young people and learn to use methods that are acceptable and legitimate from the perspective of indigenous peoples and modern thinkers alike. In short, we need a change where we will all become a little bit more indigenous and a little bit more scientific.
Thank you very much, Roy. I think you've rightly said we all need to find ourselves a bit of indigenous selves, and we can start by looking back at our food systems and increase the diversity on our plate. Thank you very much, sir. I'd like to now invite the next speaker, Sri Biju Negi, who's connecting from Dehradun. Biju Negi, as we all know as his name, he's actually Vijay, but he likes to call him Biju as in seed. He's the seed himself. So Biju Negi is the core member of the Bij Bachao Andolan, Save the Seeds movement, started years ago in Uttarakhand. He's a writer, documenter, researcher, trainer, advocate, and consultant on small and marginal farmer issues and concerns. For example, food sovereignty, security, agro-biodiversity, conservation, biodiversity-based ecological agriculture, local food, etc. He is currently developing Sub-Ni, a platform bringing together farmers and consumers to become allies. He's also a member of the Sarvodaya and founder of the Hind Swaraj Manch, espousing the Gandhi Vinoba thought, philosophy, and action. So I'd like to welcome Biju Ji, also my colleague and dear friend, connecting with us from Dehradun. Over to Biju.
Hello. We could start with the slides as well. Could you also put up the slides, the presentation?
Let's give us a moment.
But namaskar, namaste, good evening to all of you, and heartiest felicitations on today, Kartik Purnima and Guru Purab, the Guru Nanak Jayanti. It seems we are here on a very happy occasion. I would like you to also start actually the presentation, and I can talk along. Well, next, we don't have to say much about this, but please reflect on what is said. I prefer to use the term Kheti Kisani because there is very little else that communicates this system that we are talking about so holistically. And well, agriculture could have been an equivalent, except that we do not have any more culture in agriculture. Next, please. Let me begin by acknowledging that whatever I have learned of agriculture and whatever I have written or have spoken has come partly from my readings, but largely from my interactions and observations of small farming communities, and particularly extensive talks tete-a-tete with particularly the women of the mountains and elsewhere. So I wish to acknowledge them in whatever I speak and pay my respects to them. Just to clarify, Biju was not because of Bachao Andolan. I think Vijay traditionally at homes are always called Biju. It so happened that, well, I am in this Bij Bachao Andolan. So it was in mid-1980s. Oh my God, 1980s makes me feel old. It was that long ago that the idea of conserving traditional seeds and crops first took place. It was not a very easy discussion to take place, because just imagine mid-1980s, some of you who can, just imagine those times when green revolution was the idea to look up to. And Harit Kranti was not yet exposed to be what it really is, Harit Bhranti. So the movement or the idea itself was considered quite regressive. And if I were to use a word from today's parlance, the idea was trolled. And I wonder if she was around then, what would Kangana Ranaut would have said about this idea? But some people who may have been generous said that this idea, the idea of saving crops and seeds, traditional crops and seeds, was a little ahead of its time. Though I don't think so. It was quite ahead of its time. Probably the others were late. So this, or if they were a little more generous, they would say about this movement that it was path-breaking. Like documenting the agrobiodiversity of the Uttarakhand hills, or helping in the revival of Baranaja, the traditional multi-cropping system, which we believe today in a world that continues to be riven with hunger and malnutrition, provides a key to look at the path ahead. But more important than these has been our own evolution. Evolution in the sense that from a mere thought or an idea and an activity or action, today the whole concept of Bij Bachao has become a sort of a principle and a philosophy. And also equally important for us, it has been for us a generational learning experience. So what I will do is share some of the learnings from this movement and our times in it. Next, please. I'll just list out 3 learnings from the very many that we had. And that traditional agriculture that we in Bij Bachao Andolan talk about is not just about seeds and crops, but it is about the principles of agriculture, of traditional agriculture, which sought to maintain balance among humans, animals, plants, water, air, the soil, the earth. This is a major learning. The second learning, important learning, was that traditional agriculture is strongly located in its immediate geography. You can call it localization. And this location in its immediate geography is what gave traditional agriculture its strength. It facilitated the development of what we call indigenous knowledge and wisdom, and ensured the sustained practice of that agriculture, including social survival and well-being. And the third important learning for us was that traditional agriculture is deeply rooted in its sociology. It's not isolatory. And by saying that it is rooted in sociology, what I mean is it enables self-sufficiency, yet means interdependence between communities within a society, which lends collective support to individual effort. So you retain your individuality and yet you work collectively. So these we found are three major learnings. And on these, there are dependent many other learnings. Next, please. So what I will do is, given the time available, it is always very difficult to speak in a short period of time. But I'll make some very short statements, assumptions, or questions. And I hope that you will take these more for your own reflection. I will not talk about all of these, but I'll just pick up a few. The Green Revolution, hunger and more production. When we attained our independence, the major problem was hunger. Hunger which emanated from, one, the Great Bengal famine, and two, the Second World War equations. So we were in a state of hunger. The country was in a state of hunger. But and then came the Green Revolution, but what did it offer? The solution offered by Green Revolution for hunger was more production. I hope you are able to see the anomaly in this, that the problem was hunger, the solution was more production. There is something wrong in this. Is production the solution to hunger? Today we have more than adequate production, and yet we are the 5th largest country in terms of hunger and malnutrition. Production is an issue of distribution. It is not an issue of hunger. So we need to understand, but we were fed this, that the country was hungry, and so it needs more production. But please understand, there is a difference. And like the term hunger that they introduced amidst us, they also introduced this word subsistence. You must have, we always read about this, and you also must have read about it or heard about it, that mountain agriculture is subsistence agriculture. Now, what does subsistence mean? It means growing for your own survival. But I think the biggest subsistence agriculture are the corporates, the Bill Gates. They are doing subsistence agriculture because they are doing it for their survival. Ours was not a subsistence agriculture that it was made out to be. And I can only say for Uttarakhand, but I suppose this stands true for all other parts of the Himalaya, that we grew more than enough for ourselves, and markets were always there enough. We produced for ourselves, and the surplus was always sold in the markets. I come from Pauri, and people in my village A few months after the harvest had taken place and people had saved for the next 6-8 months, the surplus was sold to a place called Kodwar on one side and Ramnagar towards Kumaon on the other side. And there were only 3 things that were traded back. People sold their surplus in these markets and they bought only sugar or jaggery, salt, and cotton cloth. Now, how can you call this subsistence agriculture when you are growing everything yourself? So please just think about this. The other fake word was that we need more production. My belief is we do not need more production. To be more exact, we do not need more production from less people. We do not need more production by less people. We need more production by more people. We don't want just a few companies producing for the whole world. We want more farmers, more family farmers. And I believe we are still part of the decade for family farmers. We want more people to produce. So there is this whole question of localization also here, which is what gives us the traditional agriculture, the traditional crops, our strength. I'll skip the next one. The traditional activity was always go back, please. Go back. Traditional agriculture was always a community activity. People had individual lands to work on, but they worked in a manner of community and they shared in a manner of community. And it is this community activity which developed what we call traditional knowledge systems, what we call traditional survival systems also. So please remember that we need, if we want to talk about agriculture today, we need to look at the community part of it. Is it so? No, possibly no, because the families in the villages are becoming more and more nuclear. And there is also migration. So there is very little community activity. But we need to realize why our agriculture was high, at a high level that time, was because it was done in a community manner. And possibly this communal character of the agriculture was also responsible for the lack of communal agriculture today is also one of the reasons for the depredation by wild animals. The other point I would like to briefly mention is agriculture was never a merely economic activity. It was the center of our life. It was something which governed everything around us. You all know about the Chipko movement. It is often stated to be a movement to save the forest. I do not think so. It was not a movement per se to save the trees or save the forest, but save the forest in their capacity as the providers for our agriculture system and for our social system. Because the forests were useful for our agriculture and our sustenance and our survival and our well-being, so we saved the forest. Which is why today, I dare say, it may not be possible to have another Chipko. Because today, agriculture is not the part of a life that it was and it could have been. Unfortunately, the monetization that we see in agriculture today has sought to work in a detrimental way. Just think about this. Because agriculture is not just economic, it has an ecological role, it has a social role, it has a cultural role, and it has a political role, and as a community activity. Just a very small observation and a question. This question emanates from my own experiences in our hills. Ever since, in the last decade or so, or more, ever since families became nuclear, and ever since people started migrating for jobs, first the male members and now the whole families, now for the reasons of education, very little original songs have come from the hills, from the villages. We used to have so much, entire literature came from our life in the hills. But ever since agriculture has stopped being the center of our activity, the center of our being, as I use the word, we have stopped creating. And because it was so many other activities, by monetization, we have reduced to just its economic facet, and we need to go back to its other functions like ecological, social, cultural, and political. And so hence, I would like to support food sovereignty, not so much food security, because it may be easy for the government to say that don't worry, we can give you 3 meals a day. But the question remains, what kind of meals? What quality of meals? What taste of meals? So we would rather support food sovereignty, which gives us the power to make decisions on what we want to grow, how much we want to grow, and not just growing. Food sovereignty means that we demand and we seek and we wish to take the land that will make food possible, the water that will make food possible, the forest that would make possible. And coming back, because when we see agriculture as the center of our being in a holistic manner, then so many other occupations and professions which have been marginalized or even have gone extinct could be revived. The whole issue of trees, the wood from the forest, the fuel from the forest, the whole issue of wood for implements in our agriculture and other things. And so we would like to believe that if we want to revive, if we want to talk about agriculture revival, we actually need to talk about community revival. Because only when a community is revived will we be able to practice an agriculture that will be of use to the entire society, not just the farmers, but other people who are quasi-workers or quasi-supporters of farmers. Otherwise, this is because, next please, because otherwise we have limited this, and you will observe this. I'll just talk just on a few of these, that we realize that organic is the big thing now. Vinita, you also mentioned this now. But in the last 1 year, what we also realized that but for a few successes, very few successes, the same concerns, the same problems, the same domination by corporations, which existed or which overpowered our traditional agriculture, is now overtaking the organic agriculture, the big market system. And this is a direct experience even at the local level. You know? you have big companies getting into online organic selling and selling miles away. Why can't we develop localization? Why can't we develop local markets so that a majority of people can benefit? So if you look at the last 1 or 2 years, you will realize the successes in organic agriculture are just a few that you can count on your fingers. It is the corporations which are beginning to dominate and now control this whole issue. And one point that I would like to talk about the post-corona epidemic is the whole issue of migration. Uttarakhand saw a whole lot of people from urban centers returning to their village during this period. I presume they have returned to other states. In other states also it's the same story. But today, sad to say,
Wrap up
that,
in about 5 minutes, please.
oh yeah, this is the last slide. But today, unfortunately, the majority of people who had returned to their villages have now willy-nilly gone back to their earlier destinations of cities and other urban centers. Uttarakhand has a Palayan Ayog, how do we call it? A migration commission. And before the epidemic, we used to hear a lot about this commission. There were a lot of conferences, there were a lot of meetings, there were a lot of programs being talked about. But I hope I'm wrong. But when this migration actually came back to a state, when people actually came back to a state, we didn't see this Ayog in the way that it should have functioned. So I like to end here and end my final slide. Last slide, please. But that is all to thank you, actually. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Biju-ji. I think this is food systems. It was food for thought. And as you rightly said, agriculture at the center of our very being. I think this says it all. And now I hope Mr. Frank Roy is also around as we have some questions. I'll just first, I'd also request all those who are connecting with us online that if you have questions, you can please send it on the chat box, which is on your screen. There are some comments. I can read that out first. Mr. Lepcha said, it is true that my grandmother used to say, always eat seasonal fruits and vegetables. That was a very wise advice. There is one question. It doesn't say for who, but I think either of the panelists can say. It's from an unknown person. It says, does a changing world require our indigenous cultures to evolve? What could be the role of modern day indigenous youth in not only preserving, but also defending our indigenous culture? I can invite either of the panelists to take this question, please.
Mr. Roy, please, you can go start and I can follow.
Mr. Roy, are you there? I think he may have lost the connection. Biju-ji, would you like to take this question?
Yes, certainly we need to evolve, number one thing. But then this question also raises another question which I would like to pose to all the people attending this. We have a whole lot of agriculture activities going around in the hills, in villages. Women groups are there, NGOs are working. And people who are engaged directly in this are also earning well. And yet, have we ever wondered that a majority of these farmers yet do not want their children to come into agriculture. Please think on this whole question. Why? Because we are seeing agriculture in a compartmentalized way. So this is a question we must address, that why is a youth. I'll give you an example. This short of Missouri, this family had 2 sons coming in, and they plowed their fields that year, last year, 2020. And from their field, they earned 60,000 rupees, whatever they grew. And yet, at the end of it, they returned to Delhi. So we need to seriously discuss, think about, ponder over this question. And I would dare say to the original words of the question, that in a changing scenario, I think if this earth, if this world has to survive, the future has to be an agricultural society.
Thank you very much. And are there any questions from the audience here? There is a comment coming from another participant. The 3 laws were in the benefit of farmers, but we could not convince a section of them despite our best efforts. Oh, it is this today's news. There is a question with, would you like to comment on this day's very current scenario of the government announcing to take back the 3 laws, which were supposedly in the benefit of farmers?
Given the fact that in the last few years, there is a lot of distrust and fear, I think it will be a bit too early to comment on this taking back of the 3 laws. Because there are larger questions involved.
Yes, I think that's well said. And I think we don't have any more questions or comments coming. So I'd like to wrap this session up. I'd like to thank our panelists, Mr. Ma Frang Roy, Mr. Biju Negi, and Abhishek Pradhan. I think we've had a very, very exciting, very good, very thought-delving session. So thank you very much. And over to Roshan for the next segment of this session. Roshan.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you all for joining online, and please do type in your questions into the chat box. We are continuing with the food session, and I think this is an important session considering the important aspects that we've been talking about in the past 2 days with the focus on One Health. I'd like to request if Prerna could run the presentation. We are really happy that so many people are joining online for our discussion in trying to figure out what One Health means for the IHR. And just wanted to run through a few thoughts in the next slide, where we look at the changing consumption patterns, because I think both Bafrang and Mr. Biju Negi talked about indigenous cultures and agriculture, but in the next slide, I think we want to kind of focus on the challenges and also recognize the dramatic changes that have come about. I do not want to dwell upon the diversity, but I think the diversity has to be acknowledged, and the micro agroecological diversity right across the Indian Himalayan region is just something that we should be proud of, and that's what makes IMI so important also. But in this diversity, if you look at the next slide, please, is that this diversity has definitely given us nutritional security and food security. Sovereignty is definitely being questioned, I think, indirectly by both Mr. Biju as well as Bafrang. But I think the next slide really talks about the shifts that we've seen lately, and this is quite a frightening data that has emerged, where between 2012 2018, we've had dramatic dietary shifts to packaged and processed food, and we've doubled the amount of monetary exchange between these years with packaged food coming in. And this has influenced mountain food cultures also. And I think the questions that Abhishek ran kind of shows preferences that are changing, and that has great implications into our own nutritional security, and has greater significance when we are talking about building back better with COVID. In the next slide, we want to focus upon a slight intersect and a change by talking about the data that have been shown from 2018 to 2021 with the Himalayan cleanup, where we do a waste and brand audit. We are not cleaning up the Himalaya, but we are informing ourselves as to what is happening. And we see more and more plastic packaged food coming into our mountain landscapes. And if you look at this year's data, 66% of it is food packaging. And that is an indication and an additional lens when we are talking about food and nutrition security and food systems in the Indian Himalayan region. And in the next slide, we break this data down further, where in this household audit we did in 2021, this year, the dramatic amount of plastics that is being generated. And this intersect cannot be lost, because sometimes discussions tend to be segmental, and we talk about production systems, but we're not talking about the entire loop that is there. And plastics are playing an important part in this pollution and in this challenge that we are facing in this time. In the next slide, we'll go into how much of it is food packaging and how much of it is non-recyclable. And then I think this is a question to be asked, because we've been thrown this dominant narrative that plastic is recyclable, but majority of the Himalayan cleanup shows it is non-recyclable. The next slide will talk about we are what we eat. And on one hand, there is the indigenous food cultures and the diversity and the strength that we derive our nourishment and acknowledge our ancestors to. But this dramatic change of multi-layered plastic, hyper-processed, high in salt and sugar, is something that is very frightening. And this picture kind of shows, like in the midday meal, that's what is the waste that is generated outside. Definitely not being given inside, but outside, this is what is being generated, and all of them multi-layered plastic. We take this discussion a bit more forward because it has great significance in COVID. And to through the lens where Mr. Bijunegi talked about food sovereignty, but I think there is a larger thing that is also at play besides seeds, where a lot of the Himalayan cleanup data shows huge intersects of large food, big food being major contributors of the plastic pollution in the mountains. And so this plastic pollution does intersect with food and nutritional security, which we talk about in the next slide, please. And not just that, this particular data is in sync with the India brand audit also, which was released yesterday. But there are nuances that we also have to acknowledge in the Indian Himalayan region with the borderlands we occupy, where some of these brands are not so, it doesn't get represented. So specifically for us, we have a few brands that is not represented in the India brand audit. The Himalayan cleanup brand audit, the India brand audit, and the global brand audit are actually in sync, and the top polluters have remained the same companies. And this narrative needs to be brought into focus from both the intersects, which we talk about in the next slide. The intersects of both food, nutrition, and waste, because the one hand, we are having an issue of well-being with the lack of agriculture, but at the same time, the food we are consuming is also leading to a waste crisis in the mountains. And this drastic change is being seen in what we eat and what we waste. And that is an intersect that we want to bring into focus into this debate of sustainable food systems. And in the next slide, we want to highlight these things, that the narrative is not just about production systems, but also consumption systems and the entire intersect of how waste comes about, and the role that individuals need to play in terms of reflection and switching, and also in terms of demanding how it should be, and not just talk about what is available or the notion of convenience. I just wanted to set this context into the second segment of today's discussion on sustainable food systems with these thoughts, and hand it over to Abhishek to run a quick poll as a way forward before we have the highlight of this evening with Mr. Kurara coming in later. Abhishek, please.
Thank you, Mr. Roshan, for setting the context, the second segment of our discussion. So the link to the second poll has again been put into the Hubilo chat box. And it will be shared in the screen very soon. So the question for the second poll is, the first question out here is, where does most of your food come from? It is again a word cloud. Oh, sorry, it's a dialog box. So like we already have answers. They come from local markets and marts, village and bazaar, from local, the standard local farmers, local market and retailers like Big Bazaar, Reliance, own farmland, local heart and nearby markets, directly or indirectly from the plants. Yeah, that's true. From local markets, local grocery and local markets, from local markets, mixed like local food and corner shops and online. From the local markets, locally farmers, local markets. Oh, that's great. We have a lot of support to the local market right here. So I think so we should go to the next part of this poll. So the next question is again, it's a multiple choice question, like where we try to ask that, is traditional food still relevant today? And there are only 4 options. So I hope everyone is voting. So the question is, how relevant is local food in the present day? We have 4 options. They are becoming very popular day by day. They are very relevant. And the answers are coming in. Okay, so yeah. One person says that it's vanishing. It could be easily found some years ago, but now they are disappearing. And someone says that the local food, traditional food are actually lost. They show up very rarely and mostly during festivities. Some people actually think that they are becoming very popular, more popular day by day. So that's an interesting insight. There is actually a draw between becoming popular day by day and vanishing. So yeah. Okay, there is again a tie between becoming popular day by day, vanishing and getting lost. So I think so if we have one winner, we can close the poll for now. Okay, the winner is that it's becoming more popular day by day. And if we look at to one part of it, it's actually true, because as people are polishing their understanding about the whole local food culture and system, we are actually realizing that the local food is actually much better than those that have been highly advertised and endorsed by celebrities. So yeah, I think so. With this, we can close the poll, and I hope this becomes the reality in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Abhishek. He's been doing an amazing job in running these polls. But I now shift on to welcoming our third speaker for this evening. I'm really honored and privileged to introduce Mr. Amit Khurana, who is the Director of Food and Safety and Toxins Program in Center for Science and Environment. And we are glad to have him here tonight, this evening, to present his presentation. And Mr. Khurana is really interested in policy and practice on issues of junk food, non-communicable disease, pesticide use, organic natural farming, and linkages to antimicrobial resistance. And that is like a quick introduction. And then I think he will introduce the subject matter, because I think that's going to be a really powerful way of introducing what he's going to speak on. We look forward to you for the next 15 minutes, Mr. Khurana. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Roshanji, for inviting me, having me here, and in particular, setting the context. I was actually struggling how to fit my talk here in this particular conversation. So if I'm allowed, can I just share my screen, my presentation?
Yes, yes, of course.
Okay, is it visible to everyone?
Yes, Mr. Khurana.
All right. So this is about the other side of the story, if I may say so. I would be focusing on industrial food production and in a way sharing our journey on three different issues which are linked with industrial food production, and of course what are the policy changes and how industry has played a role on how things have moved on overall. So these are the three issues I would be talking about. Junk food, essentially about labeling here. I'll be then talking about honey adulteration, the business of adulteration in particular, and then the issue of antibiotic misuse and overuse in food animal production, and antimicrobial resistance. I must confess that I have quite a few slides. I'll try and see where I really need to deep dive. But the idea here is, of course, to put it together so that the viewers can see it and refer to if needed later on. And of course, anybody can come back to me for any questions and more details. So the first part of this is about junk food labeling. You can see on the left-hand side, this is where we are today. Not exactly, this is not from an Indian company logo, but this is where we are. You would have seen this kind of nutrition fact logo at the back of the pack on most packets. But where we want to really go is towards warning labels. And why? On the right-hand side, this is from Israel in their language. But of course, we want a similar one in India because junk foods are actually not foods, right? To be very honest, I mean, my view, in fact, the scientific community now also is realizing that these are actually factory-made products. We do not use these chemicals in our kitchens. These are concoctions actually of salt, sugar, fat, no matrix. So the foods per se does not suit them. So it's better they are called as factory products. And these are very unbalanced. In fact, highly unbalanced. They are addictive. And if someone wants to call them foods, it's better to call them bad foods. And people therefore need to be warned about these, just like tobacco, as they cause ill health. They're not only high in salt, sugar, fats, but they're also low in good things, which is fiber, and let's say the micronutrients. And we all know they are linked with NCDs. This is what we did, a cover story in Down to Earth in December 2019. We basically did a laboratory study to find out the levels of levels of fat and salt, and across different products which are popularly sold in our country. And you would see that you can see the red octagonal boxes just below the labels. This essentially reflects that how many times the salt or a fat content in a particular product was higher than the threshold set by the Food Safety and Standards Authority of India in 2018. And you can see these levels are many times higher than the thresholds. And the draft law at that time was that these should be labeled red. Of course, it had a lot of opposition from the industry. But clearly, we could see that if that law would have been in place, all of these food products would have been red. September 2021, just a couple of months ago, we did another study. And this time it was more about figuring out where we are going wrong and capturing the history of this entire issue of food labeling, which was starting from 2013. And this is what we found. So after our study of 2019, industry pushed back hard. For about a year, the entire 2020, FSSAI worked. They did some study. They also set up another working group. And that working group again set up another set of threshold levels. And you can see that these basically were many times higher than the limits which were set earlier also. And we could see that how the industry played a role in lobbying with the food, with, I would say, the weak regulator, in coming up with a very relaxed set of limits. And these thresholds, if you could actually see, compare it with the actual levels of the products, you would see that in most cases these thresholds were much high. They were actually much higher than the actual levels. So a green pass was already given to many of these products. And if you see the global standing part, the many countries across the world have set these thresholds, set these limits. And again, these were many times higher. This is just to give you a sense on what kind of labels are there. And I have told you where we want to be. We really want to be on the warning label side and not the others which confuse. This is a journey. I'm sorry, I would not be able to go into detail, but just to let you know, it all started in 2014 when we were part of that expert group led by FSSAI, which recommended front of pack labeling. And that time it was more about traffic labeling. Several committees were set up. After that, a draft came in 2018, and then another draft came in 2019. And then we did a study basically saying that things are really not going in the right shape. And then FSSAI again set up a series of meetings in January 21. For over 6 months, 6 meetings were held. And it is again, we are actually back to square one in many ways. This is just to give you a sense on how the dilutions happened in terms of what should be displayed. How the total sugar in 2018 become added sugar in 2019, how the total fat became saturated fat, how salt became sodium, essentially to confuse the consumer and not really tell them about how much bad their food is. No one knows what is sodium. I mean, even the technical experts would struggle to convert sodium into salt. And there are reasons for industry to actually go for saturated fat and not for total fat. But I would not go into all that detail, just to give you a sense on the dilution that happened at the nutrient level. Another dilution is, I mean, I'm just giving you this slide to give you a sense that on the left-hand side, there's a chance actually that maybe the industry is pushing for something like this on the left-hand side, 5-star logo for a junk food. Imagine what an irony. Something which will actually be it's like a BEE rating for electricals, wherein stars represent, number of stars represent goodness or resource efficiency, let's say. And that's how it will play with the consumers if this comes into picture. Again, too much numbers. And of course, the below you can see the red light thing, which has a lot of scope to play around. I will again not go into details, but what we really want is something on the right-hand side, of course, in the English or Hindi language, which has symbols, which can transcend the barriers of language and literacy in our country, and does not have many numbers because numbers are already there on the back of the pack. Let me now come to the second part of the business, which is the business of honey adulteration. We did this study in December 2020. We released it. The entire 2020 was about COVID. Sometime in March, April, we could see a lot of honey ads coming up. And we were also hearing before that from the beekeepers that they were not really getting the prices of the honey, raw honey that they used to get. And then of course we knew that honey actually is perhaps how much of it is sold. We do not know that whether we are actually producing that much. So what is happening in the industry? We really wanted to know. And then of course the other lead was that globally there were a lot of issues with the honey adulteration we were reading about. So that prompted us. We actually sent these samples to the lab, and that's what it is about. So we tested about 13 brands. Only 3 passed the test of adulteration. Overall, these were 22 samples, only 5 passed. And we knew that honey is bad. Honey is not bad, but when honey becomes sugar, and if that is being sold during the COVID times, there's something really wrong. Perhaps it is doing more harm than good. So that again tells you about why we were so keen to figure out the honey business. We figured out that we actually sent the samples to the laboratories in India, and the Indian standards were only in few honey, which was a small scale honey, we could found that it was adulterated by simple sugars, let's say C3 or C4 sugars. But then this was not the case when we sent all these samples to a lab in Germany for some advanced tests. The story completely changed, and therein we suspected something is wrong, and that essentially is that the Indian standards were not really able to catch this issue, and therefore it's not really about adulteration. It's also about how the business of adulteration has evolved. These were the brands which we found were problematic, which failed actually on the advanced test. NMR test is what we got it done, nuclear magnetic resonance imaging test. Surprisingly, this test is for exports in India, but not for the honey sold in our country. These were some smaller brands which also passed some of the basic tests, which I mentioned earlier about C3 and C4. These were the other set of the lot which passed overall all sets of tests, including the NMR test. The real issue here was that Indian standards were not able to catch the adulteration. And we also could figure out that there's a strong Chinese link to it. And Chinese companies were advertising that they have syrups which can bypass the Indian tests. And these websites are the basic trade websites that or market aggregator websites, which we see. We tracked down these syrups in China and India. We actually spiked the honey, the raw pure honey, with these syrups. And essentially we could figure out that yes, it was even after spiking, these were not able to, these were passing the test. So we could then figure out where we are going wrong. I will move a bit fast now and straight away move to something like, yeah, so this slide is important. We actually spiked up to 50% of it, which actually got passed. And this slide is about that even now this technology is in India. We could figure out the producers, manufacturers in India who are making these all pass syrup, and we again tested based on their syrups, and things were very similar to the that yes, even those were passing all the tests. But what does this mean? This basically means that because of this huge adulteration, beekeepers were going out of the business. And a lot of beekeepers came to us that how they had to downsize or leave their work. And that basically means that if beekeepers are not really doing what they otherwise would do, the bees are then of course decreasing. And that of course we know that bees have a very important role in the ecology as pollinators. and therefore there's a risk to productivity as well as a risk to life. So clearly this was not only about health, but this was also about livelihood of beekeepers, and of course the food security and the other parts of the ecosystem. We actually basically asked the government to stop the imports from China, the syrups that were coming from China. And we also wanted a public testing and a better enforcement and audits, and a lot of declaration from the industry. So essentially, we try to address this issue from all angles, and some things happened, but a lot didn't happen. Nevertheless, it's important that the consumers now know and they make the right choice about the honey. The third and very important issue is about antibiotic misuse in food animal production. So this week, just to let you know, from 18 to 24 is about it's a World Antimicrobial Awareness Week. And we are also observing it as in CSE, and of course India is also observing it. But just to let everyone know, what is AMR? It's actually a silent pandemic, unlike COVID-19. We all know antibiotics are becoming ineffective. In fact, those which are considered last resort are also failing. But because this is silent, and it is, people do not really know about it. And that's why this awareness week that is being celebrated world over or observed world over. But what is important is that antibiotic resistance mainly happens when the bacteria is exposed to antibiotics. That basically means the more we use, the more we lose. So, and they are a public good now, but they are continually misused and overused in the intensive settings, intensive food animal production settings. And this impact again is not only on health, it's also on the plants, the animal health, and of course, therefore linked with the food productivity, livelihood, and economy and development. These are numbers which tell you the scale of the problem. These are estimated numbers. This is the slide which basically suggests how the FAO and the global agencies, WHO as well, are linking this entire issue of AMR with the Sustainable Development Goals, and we can see some of those are linked with food. SDG 12 is about responsible consumption and production. So clearly the use of antibiotics is linked with the intensive settings, and of course, AMR is linked with the SDGs. So it's again going beyond the health and affecting the health and the health of people and the environment and the livelihood of farmers. That's about the economics of it, projected losses to GDP, livestock, and of course the people in extreme poverty, the additional number of people that can be forced into extreme poverty, some estimates only, but clearly tells us the scale of the problem. This is about the four drivers of AMR, if I may say so, and two belong to the food production systems, the animal side of it and the crops. And on the right-hand side, you can see poultry for meat, eggs, sheep farming, pig farming, aquaculture, crop agriculture, and of course, farming for animal feed. This is essentially about what are the three ways in which the indiscriminate use of antibiotics is happening. It's happening for non-therapeutic use, primarily growth promoter and disease prevention. We recently did a study on the use of critically important antimicrobials. This is a classification. I mean, these are antimicrobials which are used in humans, and the resistance against them is already high, but they are needed for to save lives, and therefore WHO has classified them, and there's a list of it. The point here is that these kind of antibiotics are also used a lot in the Indian setting. And the other point that this report captures is that the global agencies, the different agencies are not really helping. The guidance they are giving to the countries is also, there's lack of coherence there. This is just to tell you how the intensive food production, basically how antibiotic use, the easy availability of antibiotic use has led to it become a cheap substitute for preventive practices, and how it is fueling the intensive production, which actually is a driver for AMR, is also a driver for climate change, it's also a driver for zoonosis. So that's the broad connection of intensive food production system, how it is really a problem for the health of people and the environment. Some snapshots here. These are the drivers I'm sure everybody would know. We all know what is the situation in intensive farming settings, high stocking densities, confined conditions, limited focus on animal husbandry, a lot of dependence on commercial feed, and often these are geographically concentrated and vertically integrated. The drivers on the left side, of course, we all know, growing demand for protein, food, population, growing income, so on and so forth. These are the three broad sets of impacts of intensive food system. We all know zoonosis, amplification of pathogens, loss of disease resilience, pandemics, foodborne illnesses, nutritional deficiencies, so on and so forth. On the environment, you see monoculture, loss of biodiversity, GHG intensive processes, natural resource degradation, and of course, groundwater related issues. And the third is, of course, livelihood. We all know how small farmers are at a loss here. We all know over the last few months how things have happened, essentially focusing on the issue of transforming food systems and moving towards sustainable food systems. The good thing is that yes, that this recognition is there, the momentum is building up. The key question is how we now go about it in India, or let's say in different parts of the world. So what we know now, we clearly know intensive food systems are chemical dependent. Antibiotics or other chemicals are playing a big role in fueling that. We know that these systems are growing. The food production is growing for the last many decades. It is expected to grow further. We also know these systems are not sustainable. So what we need to do is to transform the systems and find sustainable ways to produce food. But there are key questions. The questions are, and we all need to think about it, reflect upon those. Despite such high food production, a big part of the world is still undernourished, starving, overweight. How much of this is actually only about the quantity of food, but also about quality and the nutrition. I think this was also brought up by earlier speakers. Of course, the point about food production versus food distribution, and the fact that should food security be the central element to all these solutions? The answer, of course, is no. Is the demand for proteins real or created? And how much is actually required from animals? And how much of this is actually unnecessary at its first place, which can be avoided just with basic prevention and stewardship approaches? Another question is consumption. I mean, how much of that the problem can be addressed by just making slight shifts in consumption? This is more relevant for geographies where per capita meat consumption is very high, perhaps not as much for India. And of course, is the solution more about going back to basics, which is the agroecological practices, or is it about innovation or technology, or is it about both? And is there something like a sustainable intensification? I mean, the answer is no, but we see a lot of this sustainable washing happening nowadays. And of course, different countries are at different levels of intensification. And countries like India, I think, in my view, stand a better chance to unlearn and move towards sustainable practices. We really need to, from the perspective of AMR, reinvent the pathway, because we will not be able to afford something like AMR. We really need to conserve what we have, and specifically the critically important antimicrobials, and that's what we are calling a conservation agenda. The second, of course, is we need to be able to increase food production, but without use of antimicrobials or chemicals, or less use of those, and that's what we are calling the new development agenda. From the environmental side, clearly, we need to manage our waste well. That's the preventative element in the environment, and not really spend a lot on the surveillance and mitigation part. But all this, of course, can be addressed if we are more focused on the prevention side. Unlike many other countries who want to just spend money to know more and do things which perhaps can be best be avoided. We are talking about this tomorrow, so I just thought I should mention this is about the conservation agenda tomorrow we are doing as part of our campaign on the antimicrobial awareness. So with that, I finish, and I'm really sorry if I have overshoot the time. Thank you very much, Roshanji. Over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Khurana. Well received. I think a very powerful presentation and thought-provoking with a lot of questions. And it ties up what we started this morning with zoonosis and moving down to food systems, and then going back and really intersecting this complex web of what exactly One Health means. We take a few questions now before we move on to Abhishek presenting. If there are any questions here. We have a question right from the panel, but I'll still throw it down. If anyone in the audience, or is there anyone in online who would like to ask Can we make it brief?
Hello, Mr. Khurana, I'm Benita here. My question is that while you did say that the food industry you suspect is working with a backdoor F-side, try to dilute the regulations. My question is CSC trying to address this issue?
Yeah, of course. I mean, the fact that we did a cover story on this, we actually laid out all the, I mean, where the industry was trying to dilute it and how it was delaying it. And we were also part of these meetings, and we strongly objected to all this. And I can very well say that we have been fairly vocal about it, and now we have documented where all dilutions have happened. If you see this cover story, we're actually saying which meeting happened, when happened, what did that meeting said, and how the dilutions happened afterwards. So perhaps this, I could not really get into the details of it because of the paucity of time, but we really are taking up the issue.
Thank you. Anyone else? Shall we move on? Okay, we have a question coming on, and I think that's an important part of the discussion we've had also in terms of demanding all of us have a role to play. And the question is there any law to prevent this, Mr. Khurana? That's a very broad one, but I guess, and all that you said.
Prevent what? If I assume this is about honey, the answer is we do have standards for honey, but the problem is that those who are involved in this adulteration business are a step ahead than the regulators. So honey business is a global problem. It's a product which sees a lot of adulteration, and because of the technology, though there are people in this world, particularly from the China industry, we know that they have mastered the skill of bypassing the test, making the sugar syrups which can bypass the test. Having said that, there still can be a lot of work that can be done with reference to tightening up the standards, which, if not completely, but catch most of it. So clearly on honey, we have laws, and I can say these laws were there. But the fact is that some of these laws were also tinkered with over the last few years. We do not know why, and we also know that even if they do a lot of it, tests beyond a point will have to be complemented by the audits and inspections and declarations. And things like, for example, FSSAI knew that adulteration is happening, and a couple of months ago, twice in the last year and a year before, they had actually written a written order to their state officers, state FDAs, that you need to audit and catch this so-and-so syrup. But you would be surprised that the syrups those were mentioned they were not the actual ones which could be caught up in the export database. Those were differently named. So there's a lot that can be done without testing, because testing here is not foolproof. Coming to junk foods, we do not have laws on the front of pack labeling. We do have a strong back of pack labeling. Unfortunately, despite the fact that hypertension is a household phenomenon in our country, we have just now got salt as a mandatory condition to be labeled on food. And that too as sodium, which perhaps could not really be understood. We don't have much on front of pack labeling, nothing on front of pack labeling, despite the fact that the Food Safety Authority of India has a great learning experience from that green dot in green square, the veg and non-veg logo. They know that something like this works well, but they're still not doing it for let's say, warning people about all this, whereas a lot of countries in the world are doing about this. In fact, the same counterparts of these big multinationals, big food companies, who are forced by the regulators in different parts of the world, but not as much by our regulator. That's the scenario. Coming to antibiotics, we do have standards on food on antibiotics, but they are only for few. For example, we only have one antibiotic, which is called colistin, which is a last resort antibiotic, which in the last year was banned to be used in food animal production settings. There are a hell lot of number of antibiotics which are used in ICUs, but still used for non-therapeutic purposes to grow chicken faster. The question of animal health and animal welfare also comes into picture. So what we can do is, therefore, to minimize, to prevent, to make sure that the disease as its first place does not comes across at the farms, so that the need for giving antimicrobials doesn't arise. So there's a lot of thing around awareness, capacity building, good stewardship guidelines, good standard treatment guidelines, good extension machinery on the veterinary side that can be done, even if we do not have the laws. But there are many countries across the world which have banned, let's say, cephalosporins, fluoroquinolones, some cephalosporins and some fluoroquinolones, which should not be used for, let's say, in poultry or let's say in pig or dairy. We have not reached to that level right now. And the one major issue is that we always are caught up with the battle of food security, protein, the issue of protein, malnutrition, and we think that the intensive way is the right way to go, which of course is not the right way. I hope it helps.
Thank you, sir, and thank you for a wonderful session. I would actually move on now to Abhishek, who has been waiting to present his the work that they have been doing as an anchor for discourse on food systems across the mountains. Just wanted to throw in this lens that we also need standards for media ethics in how food is marketed and how endorsed.
Thank you so much, Roshanda. So, like for a brief introduction, the youth of DHI, along with all the youth representatives of the Indian Himalayan region, were doing some background activity for the whole SMBS, and it was being done for all the three thematics. For the biodiversity and zoonosis sessions, the youth activities have already been displayed, and for the sustainable food systems, we had two activities. So the first one we'd like to present is the activity. It is actually a survey which was named as Food on Our Plates. So Prerna ma'am, if you could please share the presentation. So Food on Our Plates was actually a rapid assessment survey on changing food patterns and its impact on the local food culture. Next, ma'am. So it is an opinion survey to analyze the changing consumer preferences, and we will be also reviewing the intensity of changes with respect to the residential environment. We'll be asking questions like, where do you buy your food from? What makes you buy what you buy? And the good thing is we had 255 unique entries from across the states, union territories, and districts of the Indian Himalayan region. Next slide, please, ma'am. So here you can see the breakdown of the demographics. Next slide, please, ma'am. I'll go as quickly as I can, okay? So here's some demographics about the gender representation, the age, and the representation from the various residential environments, which is rural, urban, and semi-urban. Next slide, please, ma'am. Here you can see that among the participants of our survey, we had 23.5% people who were into some kind of farming practices and 11.4% people who were engaged with food processing business. Next slide, please, ma'am. So here is the breakdown of the people who were engaged in farming practices. We can see, obviously, the maximum of them were for rural areas. Next slide, please, ma'am. And not surprisingly, most of the people who were into food processing business also came from rural areas. Next slide, please, ma'am. So we asked the question, when you think back to your childhood, do you feel what your eating habits have changed? So for that, maximum people, that is 38.8% people, claimed that there was a medium change, and 25.5% people said that there was a dramatic change. Next slide, please, ma'am. Here we can see that out of the people who said that there was actually a dramatic change, maximum of them who came from urban areas. And even for the medium change portion, maximum people came from the urban areas. Next slide, please, ma'am. So we asked the open-ended question: what do you think? What do you think are the reasons for change? And the answer which got the most votes were that less people are actually involved in traditional food systems. It was closely followed by the opinion that it was actually due to the changes in preparation methods. Next slide, please, ma'am. So in this segment, we ask that where do you buy your food from? And we had a comparison between the past and the present. So for the vegetables, we can see that the number of people who are getting their vegetables or buying their vegetables directly from the farm or the local markets has gone down, and people who are buying their vegetables from supermarkets has gone up dramatically. Next slide, please, ma'am. Here, actually, we can see the shift. So number of people who get the vegetables now from supermarkets has gone up by 186%. Next slide, please, ma'am. It's the same with dry ration. Actually, it's worst. So next slide, ma'am. So it's 190% increase in people getting their dry ration from the supermarket, and a 33% decrease in people getting it from local markets. Again, it's the same story for supermarkets. Next slide, please, ma'am. There is a 207% increase in people getting the dairy products from supermarkets, and a 38% decrease in people getting it from local markets. Next slide, please, ma'am. Even for the meat products, it's the same. Like there's increase in supermarket, and all the other sources, there's the decrease. Next slide, please, ma'am. Actually, throughout all these 4 segments, we can see that there is a 400% increase in people buying it from online markets, which means that there's a limited number of people who are buying it from online, but they are buying everything online. So next slide, please, ma'am. So for the next segment of this survey, we asked what makes you buy what you buy. Next slide, please, ma'am. So there was a question: what makes you buy packaged and processed food? And again, the same as with the earlier polls, people said that it was actually the ease of availability, ease of cooking and eating, the cravings and the taste, which got the maximum vote. And we asked that what prevents you from buying from the local markets, selling traditional items, and the maximum vote went to not having many options, not being available, difficulty in availability, and them being expensive. Thank you so much for this. And for the next youth activity, we actually did a mapping of all the local markets. Not all, but we went to all our contacts, and a lot of youth from the Indian Himalayan region actually helped in this. So thank you everyone for helping. We'll be showing a short video. It's not even 1 minute long, and it will not take your time. Okay, let's Just a brief. Hello. Just a brief announcement that this campaign of tapping local markets is still on. You can send the photos along with the location and a brief description about the market to our email address, which is smds.x.food@gmail.com. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Abhishek. We are at the fag end of our today's program, and I think all the questions have been asked, right? I was supposed to also do some of the questions, but there are no more questions. So I'm the last batsman here, so I have to sum up this rather lengthy but very, very interesting session we had today on food systems. So actually, it began actually when Professor Nongrum also made a presentation, and she had a bit on traditional food systems in Meghalaya. So that was also that's where the interest started. And it's been pretty fascinating to have such eminent speakers here and listen to them. And it really sets your mind going as to what are we eating today and where are we headed with our food systems. So I think the context was set by Binita ji, where she said that, food systems actually signify the sum total of our entire land-based culture of human activities. And the fact that food systems had actually almost vanished, and now there's a new interest in the concept of food system, and that is coming back, and this is reflected also by government action in terms of support prices for millets, the ICR research centers where integrated farming systems are now being encouraged, organic agricultural policy and things like that. So the questions he posed to the panelists, to the speakers was, can we design models for these farming systems, and and that food systems were more than just agriculture, medicine, herbs, spices, fiber, all linked to it. She mentioned a very interesting what would you call it, the Baj Banik, where she was introduced to by an old man, and the medicinal trees, shrubs, wild fruit trees, all within the growth of this forest. And then we had a poll by Abhishek, how often do you eat local food? And I think the poll was about 40% was often and 40% was sometimes. And why do we eat packaged food? Convenience, easy access, easy to cook. I think that's been reflected in this last presentation also. And what prevents you from buying from the local markets, the supply, availability, the prices, middlemen coming in. So that's, that's the trend that is happening, reflected. So then we had Bafrang Roy presenting on indigenous people's food systems, opportunities and challenges. So I've just taken notes, and it was a very interesting how he described his story of when he entered the Indian Administrative Service, and how his father had told him not to forget your traditional, your knowledge, and how he rediscovered the importance of that while he was a young officer, and so the thing was, there's no agriculture without agrobiodiversity. That's what he highlighted, and where he was working with this Adivasi population, where the Green Revolution packages failed because they said they were self-sufficient and they did not need more food. And so, he observed the systems and then went back to what his father said. So subsequently, so he mentioned that, the FAO studies have severe food insecurity was non-existent amongst traditional farming systems. And the amount of agrobiodiversity in traditional systems is amazing. In another study where over 200 to 300 food plants were identified, and again, he highlighted that the present modern day are, economic driven food systems lack empathy and care. They're dominated by profits, they're extractive, and how industrial agriculture is also forcing migration and loss of biodiversity. So current food systems are broken, so we need to push for new agrobiodiversity narrative needs, and we need to also broaden our ecological knowledge of youth. So the need to go back to indigenous food farming systems was finally highlighted by him. Then a very, very interesting presentation by Mr. Biju Negi, Voices from the Mountains, Positive Stories of Sustainable Food Systems in the IHR. So he talked about his Beach Bachao Andolan and his observations of small farming communities, especially women folk in the mountains, and how the idea of conserving traditional seeds and crops, which he started in the 1980s, that was path-breaking, and how the Baranaja traditional, multi-cropping system, reviving that, and how it was a generational learning experience, and he highlighted 3 learnings. Traditional agriculture is not just about seeds and crops, but about its principles and the need of balancing human, animal, plants, water, air, and earth. Then so I think traditional agricultural community activity, I think what he highlighted was, the center of our being is agricultural activity. And he highlighted that revival of forests, the wood for our use. Agricultural revival is actually more about community revival. So I think this is a totally new way of thinking, where we go down to our small communities, where commercial production is not the priority, and where communities can come together and support each other in the entire gamut, of life. So, and of course, during the question and answer session, this I've seen myself, is that existing farming communities do not want the children to go into agriculture. So that's the huge challenge which he highlighted. Next, we had Roshan on setting the context and changing consumption patterns. And after that, we had Mr. Amit Khurana's very interesting and very shocking presentation, actually, for much eye-opening presentation on industrial food production, the linkages with health, livelihood, and environment. So he spoke on 3 basic points. So one was junk food labeling, the honey adulteration, and the use of antibiotics. So I will not go into the details. I think we've almost we've come to the end of our time, and it's been a pretty tiring day. But I think what was more important was that this whole business of fighting the industrial production, and the way they circumvent efforts to get honest labeling done. And I mean, it's a very difficult process, as he highlighted, and a very hard battle to fight, but we must keep fighting on. So honey adulteration, I think, every time I look at a bottle of honey I consume, and I wonder whether it's safe. So at the end, I'd like to thank the speakers, Mr. Bafrang Roy, Mr. Biju Negi, and Mr. Amit Khurana. And I'd like to thank my fellow panelists here, Benita ma'am, Roshan, and Abhishek, and his youth group for their presentation and the in very very nice video they shared in the end. I'd like to thank the rapporteurs, Tapan, Chodan, Anamika, Kavya, and the entire team, Prerna, behind the scenes, everyone. And we look forward to tomorrow's presentation. Everyone looks tired here. Okay, so I'll stop speaking. Thank you for all being here. Thank you for the people who joined online and those who were here. I think we have a less population.
Thank you.
Thank you.